"You're a stain on the sterling name, Evelyn," Constance hissed, her diamonds glinting in the dim light as she shoved me hard against the freezing concrete pillar. "Did you come to beg for Merrick's charity? You don't belong in this building, let alone this garage. Get out before I have security throw you into the street like the trash you are." I stood still, the sting of her hatred colder than the air. She thought I was a beggar. She had no idea that in 30 minutes, the only voice that would matter in this courthouse was mine. I turned my collar up as the gale began to howl through the vents. The wind in Chicago doesn't just blow, it carves. On this particular Tuesday, it sliced through the concrete canyons of the loop with a surgical chill that settled deep into my marrow. I pulled my worn sedan into the shadows of the courthouse parking garage, level B2, the engine rattling with a rhythmic protest that seemed to echo my own exhaustion. At 6:45 a.m., the air down here was stagnant, smelling of old exhaust and the damp, heavy scent of midwinter. I shifted into park and sat for a second, my hands still gripping the steering wheel. To my left, a glistening sterling limousine stood like a silent monolith of old money and arrogance. It was polished to a mirror finish, reflecting the dim fluorescent lights overhead. A stark, gleaming contrast to the salt-stained fenders of my own car. Looking at it, a familiar tightness coiled in my chest. My family had always measured a person's worth by the car they drove or the zip code they inhabited. To them, I was the youngest, the outlier, the one who had traded a seat at the Sterling board table for a public service salary. I leaned forward, checking my reflection in the rearview mirror. My face was pale, my eyes a bit tired, but my expression was ironed flat. I adjusted my silk collar with surgical precision. Appearance was my only armor today. I reached into my bag and pulled out a small, heavy object, my father's old brass compass. The glass was scratched, the needle slightly sluggish, but it felt warm against my palm. He used to say that a true direction isn't found on a map, but in one's soul. I whispered those words to the empty car, a small prayer for the long hours ahead. We all spend our lives searching for a home, only to find that some doors were never meant to open for us. I stepped out of the car, the icy floor crunching under my heels. The silence of the garage was suddenly shattered by the aggressive glare of high beams. A sleek SUV roared into the adjacent spot, and before the engine had even died, the passenger door swung open. Constance Sterling emerged like a predator scenting blood. She wore a mink coat that probably cost more than my first year of law school, and the sound of her heels clicking on the concrete echoed like a death knell. She didn't walk toward me. She marched, her face twisted into a mask of regal disdain. Before I could even offer a greeting, she shoved me. It wasn't a tentative push. It was a hard, violent thrust that sent me stumbling backward. My shoulder hit a structural concrete pillar with a hollow thud, a jolt of white-hot pain shooting down my arm. I felt my leather bag slip, my files scattering across the grimy floor like fallen leaves. Constance didn't stop there. She reached for the steaming porcelain cup in her hand and, with a calculated flick of her wrist, poured the dark, scalding liquid over my leather shoes and the hem of my navy slacks. The heat stung my skin through the fabric, but I didn't move. I didn't scream. I just watched her. Constance reached into her designer clutch, pulled out a wad of crumpled $100 bills, and tossed them at my feet. The money fluttered through the air, landing in the damp oil spots near my car. "Take this charity, and get out of Chicago, Evelyn," she hissed, her voice a low, vibrating tremor of malice. "Don't you dare embarrass Merrick today by begging in the hallways. You don't belong here. You never did." I looked down at the money, then back up at her. I noticed her hand was trembling. Not with age, but with a frantic, desperate fear. She was a woman drowning in her own lies, trying to push me under to keep herself afloat. I felt a strange wave of pity wash over me, a quiet realization that her wealth had bought her everything except peace. "Mother," I said, my voice as calm as a frozen lake. "Anger is a heavy burden to carry into a courtroom. I truly hope you find a way to let it go before the doors open. I don't need your money. I already have my path." Her eyes widened, a flicker of confusion crossing her face at my lack of retaliation. She expected me to cry, to plead, to play the role of the victim she had spent 40 years trying to create. Instead, I stood my ground. She turned on her heel and stormed toward the elevator, the mink coat swaying behind her like a shroud. I remained against the pillar for a moment, the dull ache in my shoulder a reminder of the physical cost of being a Sterling. The coffee was cooling on my skin, sticky and uncomfortable, but it was just another stain to be cleaned. I knelt down and began picking up the bills. I didn't do it because I needed the $500. I did it because I refused to let her litter my sanctuary with her insults. I gathered the scattered files, my fingers numb from the cold, and stood up with my back straight. I could feel the bruise forming, a hidden mark of her hatred, but I wore it like a badge of honor. It was the final break. For years, I had held on to a thin thread of hope that she might one day see me for who I actually was. Now I understood. She saw exactly who I was, and that was why she hated me. I checked my watch. 6:55 a.m. Under Illinois law, a gesture of alms accompanied by physical battery does not negate criminal intent. My mind was already filing the incident away, documenting the time, the witness, a lone security camera in the corner, and the physical evidence. I wasn't thinking about revenge. Revenge is a messy, emotional thing. I was thinking about accountability. I was thinking about the law. My mother thought she was teaching me my place, but she had only succeeded in confirming my resolve. We all believe we are the authors of our own stories until someone else tries to rip out the pages. Standing there in the dim light of the garage, I felt a profound sense of clarity. My family had spent their lives building skyscrapers of greed and vanity, never realizing that the taller the building, the longer the shadow it casts. I was no longer afraid of the dark. I checked the father's compass one last time. The needle had finally settled, pointing true and steady. I walked toward the elevator, the damp hem of my slacks heavy against my ankle. I didn't look back at the limousine or the sedan. I didn't look back at the money in my hand. I simply stepped into the lift and pressed the button for the top floor. True power isn't the ability to crush those who hurt you. It's the ability to stand tall while they try. As the doors slid shut, I caught my reflection in the polished metal. I saw the bruise, the stain, and the glasses with the thin spiderweb crack in the left lens. But behind them, I saw Evelyn Sterling, the woman they had tried to erase, and the one who was about to rewrite the ending. The elevator ascent felt like a slow transition between two different lives. In the judge's private chambers, the air was filtered and still, far removed from the predatory chill of the parking garage. I stood before the mahogany-framed mirror, dipping a cloth into cool water to dab at the coffee stain on my slacks. The bruise on my shoulder throbbed with a dull, rhythmic heat, a physical echo of Constance's shove. I watched my reflection, but I didn't see a victim. I saw a woman preparing for a necessary surgery. There was no malice in my heart, only a heavy, quiet sorrow. Truth, when long suppressed, often has to be delivered as a blow to be felt. I reminded myself that a leader's duty isn't to be liked, but to be just. I slid the zipper of my black robe up, the heavy fabric settling on my shoulders like armor. This wasn't just a uniform. It was a boundary. Garrick Vance entered with a sharp, respectful knock, holding the final docket for the morning's session. He paused, his eyes landing on the faint purple mark near my collarbone. He didn't ask what happened. He didn't need to. Our eyes met in a silent pact of integrity that went beyond words. "The gallery is packed, Evelyn," he whispered, his voice low and steady. The Sterling associates arrived early. They're sitting in their front rows like they already own the verdict. I took the files from him, my fingers brushing the edges of the father's compass in my pocket. Integrity is doing the right thing even when everyone expects you to do the easy thing. My mother taught me how to walk, but the law taught me where to go. The hallway leading to the courtroom doors felt longer than usual. Behind those oak panels, my family was waiting for a favorable outcome, convinced that the name Sterling carried a weight that could bend the scales. I felt the weight of their expectations, a crushing pressure that had dictated my life for decades. But as I stepped toward the entrance, that pressure simply evaporated. You can't control how people perceive you, but you can control who you decide to be in the face of their judgment. I adjusted my cracked glasses, the spiderweb fracture a tiny reminder of the garage floor. I wasn't going in there as the youngest child. I was going in as the law. The bailiff's voice boomed through the chamber. "All rise!" The sound was a physical shock. As the heavy doors swung open, I walked toward the bench with a measured, rhythmic stride. I could feel the eyes of the Sterling family on me. Constance stood in the front row, her chin tilted up with that practiced, smug confidence she wore like a shield. Beside her, Merrick looked bored, leaning back as if he were attending a private club meeting rather than a federal fraud hearing. They didn't even look at the face of the judge at first. They were looking at the robes, the position, the power they thought they had already bought and paid for. I reached the bench and turned to face the room. The moment Constance looked up, the air seemed to vanish from the courtroom. I watched her face drain of color, turning a sickly, ashen gray. Her jaw dropped, and the designer glasses she held in her hand slipped from her trembling fingers, hitting the marble floor with an audible crack that punctuated the absolute silence. Merrick tried to stand, his mouth agape, his face a mask of sudden, paralyzing terror. I didn't look at them with triumph. I didn't smile. I looked at them with the impartiality of a stone monument, my gaze sweeping over them as if they were nothing more than ink on a page. I struck the gavel once, a sharp, singular sound that echoed through the hall like a thunderclap. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating Constance. I could see her visible trembling from across the room, the regal predator from the garage now reduced to a confused, breaking woman. Merrick looked like he was about to collapse. I leaned into the microphone, my voice calm and resonant, devoid of the con daughter persona they had assigned to me. "This court recognizes that emotions may run high," I began, my tone steady and professional. "But justice requires a clear mind. We shall proceed with dignity, for the sake of the truth we all serve. It's a strange thing, seeing the people who once made you feel small suddenly look like children lost in the dark." I opened the folder, the tight framing of the legal documents, the only world that mattered now. I began reading the charges of federal financial fraud against Merrick Sterling, my voice carrying to every corner of the room. Every word was a brick in a wall I was building between myself and the Sterling legacy. I realized then that my family's power was always a house of cards, built on the silence and fear of others. I was the first Sterling to speak the truth in this building, and while it was a lonely burden, it was the only thing that felt real. Justice is a blind goddess, not because she cannot see, but because she refuses to look at the name on the check. Today, the name Sterling was just another file on my desk. Merrick's defense attorney stood up, his voice shaky as he attempted to file a preliminary motion for a closed-door session, citing sensitive family matters. I didn't even blink. I denied the motion immediately, citing the public's right to transparency in federal fraud cases. I specifically referenced the need for an unbiased public record, a move that signaled to Constance that her influence ended at the bar. She had spent a lifetime treating the world like her private stage, but in this room, she was just an observer. I saw her lean toward Merrick, her voice a terrified, frantic whisper that I could almost feel through the air. "What have we done?" she gasped, her hands clutching her pearls as if they were a lifeline. Merrick stared at the bench, his eyes vacant. "She's not our sister today, Mother," he replied, his voice barely audible. "She's our executioner." The courtroom was still buzzing with the ghost of Merrick's panic as I retreated to my private chambers for the noon recess. The heavy oak door clicked shut, momentarily severing the connection to the Sterling family's unraveling drama. I leaned my forehead against the cool wood, my breath coming in shallow, jagged hitches. It's a strange thing, standing on a pedestal of power while your roots are being ripped from the earth. I thought I had found a pocket of peace, a sanctuary where the law was the only voice. But as I turned, I saw the door to my inner office was slightly ajar. A sliver of light cut across the carpet and my heart hammered against my ribs. I pushed the door open to find Constance standing by my desk, her silhouette sharp against the midday sun. Before I could find my voice, she reached out and snatched the vintage brass compass, my father's last gift, from its resting place. With a terrifying, calculated slowness, she slammed it onto the marble floor. I watched as she ground her designer heel into the glass, the sound of crushing metal deafening in the absolute silence. It wasn't just an object she was breaking. It was the only piece of my father I had left. The air left my lungs, and my hand whitened as I gripped the edge of the mahogany table to keep from falling. I felt a primal urge to scream, to lash out, but I closed my eyes and reached for the memory of my father's calm voice. Have you ever lost the one thing that made you feel safe, only to realize that safety was never in the object? I stood there, watching the brass fragments glinting on the floor like spilled gold. I looked up at her, my eyes cold and dry. "You think you destroyed my direction, Mother," I said, my voice barely above a whisper but carrying the weight of a gavel. "But a compass only shows where north is. It doesn't walk the path for you. I've known my path since the day you let him disappear." Constance didn't flinch. She just stood there, her face a mask of aristocratic cruelty. I moved past her and sat behind my desk, clicking open a sealed federal file that Garrick Vance had delivered just minutes before. I slid a heavy document across the desk toward her, a forensic audit of Sterling Global Holdings that reached back an entire decade. It was the ghost contract, a piece of paper that had haunted my dreams since I first suspected its existence. Her smug expression began to fray at the edges, the first crack in her porcelain exterior. "This is the scapegoat ledger," I said, my tone as flat as a desert horizon. I pointed to the signature at the bottom of the final page. It was my name, Evelyn Sterling, signed in a perfect, elegant script. But it was a forgery. Constance had signed it 10 years ago, making me the responsible officer for a shell corporation that held $400 million in unpaid tax liabilities and fraudulent loans. She had built a cage for me before I even knew I was a bird. "You didn't raise a daughter," I continued, meeting her gaze without blinking. "You raised a contingency plan. You wanted me to be the one who burned when the empire fell." The silence stretched between us, thick with the scent of old paper and new betrayal. Constance tried to speak, her mouth opening and closing like a landed fish, but the legal reality was an inescapable trap. Under the Internal Revenue Service's equitable relief rules, I had already secured a whistleblower immunity deal. By documenting the forgery and the history of her manipulation, I had shifted every ounce of that $400 million liability back to the forger. The cage she built for me was now her own cell. I felt a hollow thud in my chest, not of victory, but of a final, agonizing clarity. They say the truth will set you free, but first, it makes you realize how long you've been living in a cage. I watched as her hand shook, her fingers reaching for the pearls that seemed to be choking her. She began to speak, her voice a frantic, desperate scramble to negotiate, but I was already standing. I adjusted my black robe, the fabric hiding the bruise on my shoulder and the broken pieces of my heart. I didn't need her apologies. I didn't need her excuses. I needed the law to do what it was meant to do. Garrick Vance was waiting by the courtroom doors as I approached. He looked at my face, then at the red-rimmed edges of my eyes. He didn't offer a platitude or a shallow comfort. He simply nodded, a silent acknowledgement of the war I was fighting on two fronts. "Gather the fragments of the compass, Garrick," I whispered as I passed him. "Even broken things can tell us where we've been. They just can't tell us where to go." He understood. He always did. It's funny how the people who aren't your blood are often the only ones who know the value of your soul. I walked back onto the bench, the sound of my heels on the hardwood echoing like a countdown. The gallery was still, the tension so thick it felt like a physical weight. I looked out at the Sterling associates, at Merrick's hollow eyes, and at Constance as she was escorted back to her seat. I felt a strange sense of grace. Justice is not about the weight of the hammer, but the clarity of the vision. We seek only what is true, for a lie is a debt that eventually bankrupts the soul. I strike the gavel, and the sound is final. "Before we proceed with testimony," I announced, my voice filling the hall with a cool, untouchable authority, This court orders the temporary freeze of all personal assets belonging to the Sterling family under the Asset Forfeiture Act. No property is to be transferred, no accounts accessed until the scapegoat ledger is fully examined by the Department of Justice. The gasp that went through the room was the sound of an empire starting to bleed. Constance leaned toward Merrick, her voice a terrified hiss. "She knows about the B7 files," she whispered. "We have to stop her before the sun sets." I watched them, my heart a stone. I didn't know what B7 was yet, but I knew I would find it. The midnight air in the Chicago suburbs was a biting, hollow chill that seemed to amplify the silence of the Sterling estate. Standing at the edge of the property, I watched the moonlight glint off the cold, regal limestone facade of the mansion. It looked like a palace, but I knew it was a mausoleum for the truth. Guided by the floor plan Garrick Vance had quietly secured, I moved toward the service entrance. Every step on the manicured lawn felt like a trespass into a life I was forced to abandon. Have you ever stood outside a place you once called home and felt like a ghost haunting your own history? It is a peculiar kind of grief, knowing the walls that sheltered you are the same ones that hide your destruction. I slipped through the heavy doors, my movements practiced and silent. The scent of the house hit me instantly. Expensive wax, old money, and the faint, lingering aroma of my mother's perfume. It was a sensory trap. As I passed the hallway leading to the east wing, a flicker of a memory caught me. I saw a younger version of myself, the ignored youngest child, standing in the shadows of a grand staircase while the rest of the family celebrated a world I wasn't invited to join. I shook the vision away with a stoic resolve. I wasn't that girl anymore. I was here for my father, and I wouldn't leave until I found the piece of him they tried to bury. The library was exactly as I remembered, stifling, mahogany-lined, and smelling of leather-bound lies. I moved toward the massive oak bookshelf on the north wall. I ran my fingers along the spines until I felt the slight indentation Garrick had described. I pulled a hidden lever, and a section of the shelving clicked open to reveal a modern electronic keypad. I didn't have to think about the numbers. I used my father's birth date. Constance never changed the code. She assumed I was too weak, too broken, to ever find my way back into this room. The lock turned with a heavy thud. They say walls have ears, but in this house, they have memories. I am not here to tear them down, but to make them speak the truth at last. Descending into room B7 felt like entering an underwater cave where the pressure increased with every step. The air was stale, thick with the metallic tang of old filing cabinets and the stagnant smell of long-term betrayal. I turned on my small flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness to reveal rows of meticulously labeled medical records and surveillance tapes. This was the archive of Constance's control. My heart hammered against my ribs, a rhythmic reminder of why I was here. I moved past the financial ledgers, my focus narrowing on a hidden compartment at the back of the vault. Inside, I found a black leather binder. My breath hitched as I opened it. It wasn't financial data. It was a medical log from a high-security psychiatric facility in rural Illinois. The name on the patient file screamed at me from the page. Arthur Sterling, my father. My hands began to shake, a violent, uncontrollable tremor that threatened to drop the binder. He was never dead. He hadn't died of a sudden stroke while I was away at law school. Constance had him committed under a false identity to seize total control of Sterling Global Holdings. She had erased a living man so she could wear his crown. I leaned against the cold metal of a filing cabinet, the realization hitting me like a physical blow to the stomach. For 20 years, I had mourned a man who was still breathing, trapped in a room while his wife celebrated his legacy with the blood money she stole. I saw a grainy video monitor on the desk and pressed play on the top disc. The screen flickered to life, showing an aged, frail man sitting by a window in a sterile room. He was clutching a small, faded drawing, a son and a house I had colored for him when I was 6 years old. The pain of it was a jagged blade in my soul. Evil doesn't just take lives, it steals time. But time has a funny way of circling back to pay its debts. I gripped the edge of the monitor, my knuckles white, my eyes burning with a mixture of fury and a desperate, surging love. Constance hadn't just stolen my inheritance. She had stolen my chance to say goodbye, to be a daughter, to hear my father's voice. I looked at the man on the screen, his eyes distant but still holding that familiar, gentle light. I whispered his name into the cold air of the vault, a promise that echoed off the metal walls. "I'm coming for you, Dad." The youngest child was done asking for permission. I pulled out my phone and began the meticulous work of documentation. Each flash of the camera was a strike against the Sterling Empire. I photographed the commitment papers signed by a corrupt doctor, the forged death certificates Constance had filed with the state, and the monthly payoff receipts sent to the facility directors. These weren't just papers. They were the blueprints of a prison. Under federal law, specifically the Brady Rule logic regarding exculpatory evidence, this proof of criminal fraud and kidnapping made the financial case against Merrick look like a parking ticket. My family was no longer just facing bankruptcy. They were facing life behind bars for human rights violations. Despite the horror rising in my throat, my thoughts weren't consumed by images of bloody revenge. I felt a strange, restorative calm. I envisioned my father breathing fresh air, sitting in a quiet garden far from the Sterling poison, his hand in mine. My kindness was my rebellion. It was the one thing Constance could never understand, and therefore, the one thing she could never defeat. A bird born in a cage thinks flying is an illness. My father taught me to fly, and now I will break the bars for us both. Mercy isn't for those who broke him, but for the soul that survived. I packed the most critical original documents into my bag and prepared to exit. The silence of the house felt different now, no longer oppressive, but fragile. The Sterling name was a hollow shell, and I was the one holding the hammer. I made my way back up to the library, closing the hidden door behind me with a soft click. I walked through the darkened rooms, passing the portraits of my ancestors who stared down with silent, painted judgment. They no longer mattered. Only the living man in that facility mattered. As I exited the estate through the service entrance, I stepped back into the Chicago night. The wind was still howling, but the air felt cleaner. I reached my car and pulled out my keys, my mind already calculating the next legal move. But then, my phone vibrated in my pocket. It was an emergency alert from my car's integrated security system. My eyes narrowed as I read the red text on the screen. "Brake system malfunction. Critical failure detected." I froze in the middle of the dark driveway. I looked at the car, then at the long, winding descent of the private road that led to the main highway. The shadows near the garage seemed to shift, and I realized then that the Sterling family's desperation had reached its final, lethal stage. They weren't waiting for a verdict anymore. They were waiting for an accident. I gripped my bag tightly, the weight of the B7 files a solid reassurance against my side. I didn't turn the key. I stood in the heavy, suffocating silence of the Sterling estate's driveway, the cold blue light of my phone screen warning me of a death sentence. The notification was a jagged claw at my throat. Brake system malfunction. My pulse didn't race. It slowed, a cold, calculated rhythm taking over. This wasn't a mechanical failure. This was a family tradition. I looked back at the house, at the dark windows that hid the people I shared blood with, and I felt a chilling clarity. They weren't just trying to bankrupt my reputation anymore. They were trying to stop my heart. I called a private towing service and slipped back into the shadows. Fear is a reaction, but courage is a decision. My family decided I was an obstacle. I have decided to be the finish line. By morning, the high-speed tension of the I-90 expressway felt like a distant fever dream. But the reality was waiting in a forensic garage. The mechanic didn't need a computer to find the problem. He pointed to the clean surgical cut through the brake line and a small magnetic tracking device tucked under the wheel well. It was Blythe's signature. Precise, cowardly, and hidden. I stood by the smoking car, the scent of burnt rubber and salt filling my lungs. I didn't call my mother to scream or cry. I stood there, a mask of iron, and dialed Garrick Vance. If they wanted a war of attrition, they had forgotten who I was. I had survived their neglect for 40 years. I could certainly survive their desperation. The battlefield shifted to a dimly lit, upscale lounge in downtown Chicago later that afternoon. Constance Sterling sat across from Garrick, the air between them thick with the scent of expensive bourbon and even more expensive lies. I watched the scene through the remote feed on my laptop, my fingers hovering over the record button. Constance slid a leather briefcase across the table, her movements fluid and arrogant. $10 million in offshore bonds. It was a king's ransom for a clerk's soul. She offered him a partnership, a seat at the Sterling table, if he would simply destroy the B7 files I had recovered. Have you ever seen the price of a person's soul laid out on a table? It's smaller than you'd think. Garrick played his part with a chilling perfection. He accepted the briefcase, his face a mask of weary greed that Constance greedily swallowed. But beneath his blazer, the camera feed remained steady, transmitting every word directly to the FBI task force I had quietly alerted weeks ago. He returned to my judicial chambers an hour later and placed the heavy leather case on my desk. He didn't look tempted. He looked like he wanted to wash his hands with bleach. "They thought my loyalty had a price tag," he said, his voice a low vibration of disgust. "They forgot I was raised by a man who taught me that a clear conscience is the only currency that doesn't devalue." I looked at the money, the physical embodiment of my mother's soul, and felt a strange, empty pity. "Kindness isn't a weakness, Garrick," I said, my voice still firm as I closed the bond box. "It's the strength to preserve humanity in a world that constantly tries to turn us into predators." We stood there in the silence of my office, two people bound together by a truth the Sterling family could never understand. The pressure was mounting. I could feel the atmosphere in the courtroom shifting, a storm brewing that would leave nothing standing. By late afternoon, the counterstrike began. Constance didn't use a knife this time. She used the media. A montage of news headlines and social media blasts began to flicker across my monitors. Anonymous sources accused me of taking massive bribes from rival corporations to dismantle Sterling Global Holdings. It was a desperate, scorched earth smear campaign. Then came the knock I had been expecting. The Judicial Qualifications Commission arrived at my office, their faces grim as they served me with a notice of temporary suspension pending a full investigation. My colleagues watched from the hallways, their whispers a dry rustle of leaves. I didn't fight them. I didn't offer a defense. I stood up, my back straight, and handed over my credentials with a stoic grace that seemed to baffle the officers. I knew the law better than Constance ever would. By allowing this investigation to proceed, I was triggering Illinois Supreme Court Rule 751. This wasn't a defeat. It was a trap. The investigation would grant me the power of discovery, forcing Constance Sterling to testify under oath in a formal hearing, the one place where her lies could not survive forensic scrutiny. Sometimes, you have to let the enemy think they've won the battle just to lure them into the canyon. I walked out of the courthouse, the wind whipping my coat around my legs. The cameras were already there, flashes exploding in the twilight like miniature bombs. I didn't hide my face. I looked straight into the lenses, my eyes clear and untouchable. I was no longer the youngest child begging for a seat at the table. I was the one who was about to flip the table over. Truth is like a cork in water. You can push it down as hard as you want, but it will always find the surface. Let them celebrate their temporary victory. The Sterling sun was setting, and the darkness belonged to me. As the JQC officers disappeared into the crowd, I turned back to Garrick, who was waiting by the elevator. I reached into my bag and pulled out the small silver flash drive containing the recordings from the B7 vault. The proof that my father was still alive, trapped in a cage of Constance's making. "It's time to play the B7 recording, Garrick," I said, my voice a cold, singular blade. "All of it. No redactions. No mercy." Garrick's hand trembled slightly as he took the drive, his eyes meeting mine. "This won't just destroy their case, Evelyn," he whispered. "It will destroy the Sterling name forever." I watched the elevator doors close, my heart a stone. "Good," I replied to the empty hallway. "It's a name that's been dead for a long time." The morning air in Federal Courtroom 402 was thick, an invisible fog of tension that made every breath feel like a chore. I sat upon the bench, my hands folded atop the dark mahogany, watching the Sterling empire fray at the seams. Merrick Sterling sat at the defense table, his skin the color of wet ash. Beside him, Constance remained ironclad, her spine a rigid line of defiance that refused to bend even as the world began to burn around her. The silence was suffocating. Have you ever stood in a room where you knew a lifetime of lies was about to end? It's a heavy, hollow feeling, like the air before a devastating storm. I took a slow breath, centering myself. This was the moment I had been preparing for since I was that little girl hiding in the library shadows. The bailiff called Merrick to the stand. His footsteps were heavy, echoing through the chamber like a funeral march. As he took the oath, his eyes darted toward Constance, but she wouldn't look at him. She was staring straight ahead, her jaw locked. The prosecutor began the questioning, but he didn't have to push hard. Merrick was a man who had never known a day of real hardship, and the prospect of a federal cell had finally broken the golden child. He pulled a hidden ledger from his briefcase and began to speak, his voice a trembling, desperate scramble for survival. He bit the tail of the serpent that had raised him, testifying with chilling detail that Constance was the sole architect of the entire fraud. I watched the total collapse of the Sterling United Front from my high vantage point. It was a sorrowful sight, a mother's decades of favoritism repaid with a son's absolute betrayal. Constance suddenly stood, an outburst of raw, jagged emotion tearing through her mask of nobility. "I did it all for you!" she shrieked, her finger trembling as she pointed at Merrick. "I built this for you!" I didn't raise my voice. I simply struck the gavel, the sound a cool blade of order that cut through her hysteria. "Order in the court," I said, my voice low and untouchable. "Merrick, continue your testimony." "Mrs. Sterling, your son is merely speaking the language of self-interest you taught him. Sit down." The atmosphere shifted as I authorized the playing of the supplemental evidence Garrick Vance had prepared. The courtroom's audio-visual system flickered, and then the speakers boomed. It wasn't music or a legal briefing. It was the raw, echoing audio from the parking garage, the sound of the first cut. The entire gallery heard Constance's cold hiss. "You don't belong here. Take this charity and get out!" Like an obedient dog. The contrast between the Queen of Chicago and the woman on the tape was devastating. The gallery gasped, a collective intake of breath that signaled the end of her reign. I sat unmoved, not enjoying the shame, but allowing the truth to exist in the open air at last. Constance sank into her chair, her face finally becoming a mask of ruin. The media feeds were already going viral. I could see the glow of dozens of smartphones in the back rows. Her carefully curated public persona had shattered in real time, leaving nothing but the brittle reality of a bully. I looked down at her and spoke quietly into the microphone. "The world finally hears the mother I've known for 40 years, Constance. It isn't my judgment that shames you today. It is your own voice. It is a hard thing to face the reflection you've spent a lifetime avoiding, but the law is a mirror that doesn't care for vanity. Despite the public execution of her character, I ensured the proceedings remained professional. I didn't allow the gallery to jeer or the lawyers to gloat. We are here to record facts, not to feast on a soul's disgrace," I told the court, my gaze firm. "Let the evidence speak, and let the law conclude." I formally admitted the B7 recordings and Merrick's ledger into evidence under the Statement Against Interest exception. This created an inescapable legal trap for Constance, linking her not just to the financial crimes, but to the long-term kidnapping of my father. The cage she built was now fortified with her own son's words. I announced a 1-hour recess before the final verdict. Standing up, I felt the heavy fabric of my robe sweep the floor like the wings of an avenging angel. I walked past Constance without a single glance of malice, my dignity untouchable. I realized then that the Sterling family was finally light, for they had nothing left to hide. The heaviest thing you will ever carry is a secret that harms another, and today, I was setting that weight down for good. As I exited the courtroom, the hum of the crowd seemed to fade, replaced by a singular, focused silence. Garrick Vance was waiting for me in the hallway, his face pale but his eyes bright with a rare triumph. He handed me a final document, his hand steady. "The rescue team just reached the facility, Evelyn," he whispered. Your father is safe. He's already being transported." I felt my eyes fill with tears for the first time in years. Warm, silent tears that blurred the polished tiles of the courthouse. I took a breath, the scent of the old building finally replaced by the hope of the future. "Tell them to take him to the lake house," I whispered back. "Tell him the youngest is coming home." The late afternoon sun poured through the high, arched windows of Federal Courtroom 402, casting long, amber-hued shadows across the heavy oak benches. I sat in absolute stillness, the weight of the judicial robe no longer feeling like armor, but like a mantle of truth. From my vantage point on the bench, I looked down at the Sterling family. Merrick sat with his head bowed, the golden boy finally tarnished. Constance remained upright, her spine a rigid line of defiance, but her eyes were hollow, reflecting the ruins of the empire she had built on bones. The silence in the room was profound, a vacuum waiting to be filled by the final word of the law. I cleared my throat, the sound echoing like a drumbeat in the stillness. I began to read the formal sentencing, my voice steady and devoid of the tremors that had haunted me for years. Merrick Sterling was sentenced to life in a federal penitentiary for financial fraud and racketeering. For Constance, the architect of our family's darkness, I handed down 20 years for kidnapping, fraud, and the systematic obstruction of justice. Under the RICO Act, I ordered the permanent dissolution of Sterling Global Holdings and the full restitution of funds to every victim they had defrauded. A sentence is not an act of hate, but a boundary drawn by society. You spent decades treating people like currency, Constance. Today, the law reminds you that human dignity is not for sale. I looked at my mother, not with the spite she expected, but with a quiet, devastating compassion. I didn't see the Queen of Chicago anymore. I saw a woman who had traded every meaningful connection for a throne made of glass. "I do not wish you pain, Mother. I wish you the quietness of mind necessary to understand why you're here. My kindness was my final rebellion, a refusal to let her poison turn me into a predator like her. The law had provided the hammer, but my conscience provided the clarity. As the final echo of the gavel faded, I did something no one in that room expected. I stood up and in a single, deliberate motion, unzipped my judicial robe. I removed it, laying the heavy black fabric across the back of the chair, revealing a simple white blouse underneath. It was a return to the self I had almost lost. I looked at the court, the cameras, and the shell-shocked face of my mother. I announced my immediate resignation from the bench. My work here was finished. I had used the system to reveal the truth, but I refused to remain part of a bureaucracy that had allowed my father to be buried alive for 20 years. They say power is addictive, but they've never tasted the sweetness of a clear conscience. I didn't win by staying on that bench. I won by knowing when it was time to leave. I walked out of the courtroom without a backward glance at the Sterling family or the media circus erupting behind me. My footsteps felt light on the marble floors of the lobby, the air finally tasting of something other than dust and secrets. I was no longer the youngest child or the executioner. I was Evelyn, a woman who had finally found her own North Star. That's where the true journey started. The drive to the lake house took me past the glittering Chicago skyline, but my eyes were fixed on the horizon where the water met the sky. When I pulled up the gravel driveway, the sunset had turned the lake into a sheet of mirrored gold. My father was waiting on the porch in a wheelchair, his frail frame wrapped in a blanket. I walked to him, my heart full of a peace I hadn't known since I was 6 years old. I took his hand. It was thin, the skin like parchment, but his grip was warm and familiar. We sat in a shared silence that spoke of 2 decades of stolen time finally being reclaimed. I reached into my bag and showed him a small glass heart. Inside were the polished fragments of his old brass compass, the one Constance had crushed. "It doesn't work anymore, Dad, but it doesn't need to. We're already where we need to be." He looked at me, a soft, recognizing light in his eyes, and squeezed my hand. "I know many of you have been there, standing in the ruins of what you thought was home, wondering if you could ever rebuild. Tell me, what was the moment you realized that your peace was worth more than their approval? For me, It was the moment I realized I didn't need them to love me to be whole. The softest voice in the room isn't always the weakest. Sometimes it's just the voice waiting for the right moment to speak the truth. My name is Evelyn Sterling, and for the first time in my life I am free. I lived in oblivion for 40 years, only to realize that the ink I used to rewrite my story is eternal.